Hey everybody, I'm Grandmaster Ben Feingold here with our weekly lecture series. Today's lecture is on a famous Midwest player, Midwest in the United States, named Richard Verber. And I want to thank David Buck and the 1995 Illinois Math and Science Academy chess team for sponsoring the lecture. If you'd like to sponsor a lecture, contact my wife. Her email is karen@atlchessclub.com. And we have sponsored lectures every Monday at 6 p.m. Eastern. Occasionally, people get confused with the time zones and they show up an hour late, which is funny for me, but probably not for the person who signed up for the lecture. So Richard Verber was a famous Chicago chess player and director and organizer in the 1960s, 1970s, and I guess maybe in the very late 50s, maybe. But I don't have any games from him from the 50s. And I recollect at like the 1979 US Junior Open in East Lansing, Michigan, when I was 9, I saw Richard Verber like in the Skittles room playing blitz chess. And I think at that point, he was playing very little and he was mainly organizing and directing. And I found 2 web pages that discuss his chess, which isn't easy since he died 23 years ago and probably didn't play any chess the last 15, 20 years of his life that was, in tournaments. He was born in 1944 in Cleveland, but he grew up in Chicago, and he became a national master in 1961, a senior master in 1971. And nowadays, being a senior master in the United States isn't something a lot of people boast about, but in 1971, having a US chess rating of 2,400 was almost unheard of. Now, if you're not 2,400 USCF and you're 10 years old, you're over the hill. But back then, that was very impressive. He won the Chicago Open in '62, the North Central Open in '66, tied for first at the 1970 Illinois Open. And I guess internationally, his claim to fame was playing in the World Student Team Championship representing the United States. And he did that 3 times in 67, 69, and 70. And in 1970, he won the gold medal on board 4, which helped the US win the championship. And one thing I didn't know before I prepared for the lecture was he was invited to play in 2 US championships, and he declined. Not sure why he declined. He died very young. I think he was 57 years old. He was a very large person, and I would guess that he was over 400 pounds. And I guess there was a slight chance that at some point in his life he was 500 pounds, but I'm not sure. He was a big guy, and I think he had complications medically due to his size. And maybe that's one of the reasons he didn't play a lot of chess when he got into his 40s and 50s. But he did play a lot of chess in the 1960s anyway. Okay, there's another page. Let me find that one. This is from chessnews.org, which has an obituary and talks about the life of Richard Verber. It has a lot of the same information as the last page. I couldn't find a Wikipedia on Richard Verber since he wasn't really a famous international player. He was more famous in the United States and in the Midwest. And of course, when he was at the top of his game, there was no internet, so not a lot of internet stuff about Richard Verber. And there was one controversy involving him, which is pretty good because Chicago chess is known for controversy. And in fact, the city of Chicago itself has controversies that are chess and not chess related. But he used to do something that Karen and I always did at our chess center when we had our chess center, which was somewhat unusual. When he had big tournaments in the Chicago area as an organizer and director, which he did often, he would guarantee the prizes, which is what Karen and I always did in our tournaments. And occasionally, if you have guaranteed prizes in an open tournament and you get a bad turnout, you lose money. And occasionally, in those occasional times, you don't have the money. And so there was one controversial tournament where people weren't getting paid because he just didn't have the money. And as a consequence, the US Chess Federation punished him by making him not a director anymore or something. Then at some point, pretty soon thereafter, he found the funding and was able to pay everybody in full, and he was reinstated. So that was, it wasn't because he didn't want to pay the prizes. He wanted to have big tournaments with big prize money, and he did. And once he wasn't able to pay the prize fund because they didn't get a big turnout, and that's always a very risky venture. And that's why a lot of tournaments in the US have based on prizes so the organizers and directors don't lose a lot of money. It's a lot of work running a tournament, and then losing money is not really your goal when you're doing so much work. But he's a very strong player. My dad knew him very well because my dad was born in 1937. My mom was born in 1944, as was Richard Verber. So my dad played chess in the Midwest, so he saw Verber many times in the 60s and 70s. And my good friend Wes Buerger, who's actually been on the stream before, who's in his 80s right now, he told me that he beat Verber in the last round of one of the US Junior Opens, I think in the late 50s, or possibly early 60s. I guess it would have been the late 50s, because he was born in 1940, Wes was. Okay, so basically the older players from the Midwest that I know, they knew Richard Verber better than I did. Okay, well, let's get to the games, if I can find such games. Yeah. Okay, and this is actually funny because my friend is Wes Buerger, who's played Richard Verber, and this guy's Edward Buerger, which Buerger spelled differently. And let me flip the board so the audience is confused. So this game was played in the Illinois Open in 1963, and in the 1960s, Verber was not only winning tournaments, he was also directing and organizing tournaments in the Chicago area. Now, one person you may know, or you may not, who is the founder, co-founder of the St. Louis Chess Club, the billionaire Rex Sinkfield, he got his chess chops playing chess in Chicago in the 1960s because he went to the University of Chicago, and that's where Rex played most of his chess and got to a rating of about 1650 before he took a big hiatus, and then he came back after he retired and started the St. Louis Chess Club. So I'm sure that he knew Richard Verber well and must have played in some of his tournaments, although since Verber was typically over 2,200, it's possible they never actually played. Okay, so Verber has the black pieces against Buerger. And I looked at a lot of games of Richard Verber, which wasn't easy to find, and he played a different opening every game. It wasn't like Verber memorized one opening and played it every game. He had all kinds of different openings with both colors. So that's interesting. And one of the things I read online, which I found quite funny, was Verber never saved his score sheets. And his tournaments were typically open tournaments, so when he passed away, they didn't have any of his games. And the only games, I guess, that are on the internet are from his opponent's score sheets or from games that were published in Midwest chess magazines. So he didn't save his score sheets. And I remember when I was a teenager and in my early 20s, and I would go to tournaments, there was a famous international master slash grandmaster, Igor Ivanov, who also died in the 2000s. And I remember when his game was done, he just left his score sheet at the board. I've never seen a grandmaster do that. He never took his score sheet. So he just left his game there. So I thought that was odd, but I guess it happens to more than one person. Okay, so they played a King's Indian. And remember, if you don't like the theory of this game was played in 1963. So I think it's actually pretty good theory considering, the game is 61 years old. Okay, so this is the same-ish variation. You could see this position in a Grandmaster game today. E5 is unusual in this position. Black can play C5, A6, C6, knight C6. E5 is a little unusual. D5, he attacks the center. And this looks like just a normal kind of chess game. Probably taking with the knight is a bit unusual. Usually they take with the c-pawn. And taking with the queen, I would just say is a mistake. And I think what white was thinking is white wants to put pressure on the d6 pawn. And in a lot of variations, black is going to sacrifice the pawn on d6. And as compensation, white has no development on the king's side. And black is able to play knight c6, knight d4. It's unusual, if we go back, that white plays d5 and then white has very little interest in keeping his pawn on d5. Because the pawn on d5 stops black from playing the natural moves like knight c6 and bishop e6. But after there was a trade on d5, white didn't want to take back with the pawn, and that let black actually play knight c6 and bishop e6. So I don't like the way white's playing the opening. Okay, so knight c6, castles queenside. He can't castle kingside because there's too many pieces in the way. And probably white thought, well, I'm going to win a pawn, so that's good. Bishop e6, sacrificing the d-pawn. White has no development on the king side. And white went back, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If you're going to play queen takes d5 to give black a weak d-pawn and then not take it, why did white do that? Okay, so obviously in this position, black is better. Black has three pieces out, and white's played queen d2, queen d5, queen d2. That's not exactly what white should be doing. Okay, so rook c8, putting the rook on the same file as the white king. King b1, knight to d4. A lot of times we play knight to d4 even when it sacrifices a pawn, but here it does not. And not only does it not sacrifice a pawn, black's threatening the pawn on c4. b3, and I mean, basically, you can't play b3 and you can't give up your c-pawn. So, I mean, if I was white, I guess I'd play rook c1, I guess. Because you can't lose your c-pawn for nothing. You can't play b3. He did play b3, but I mean, the only reason I wasn't very upset when he played b3 was I wasn't alive yet. I have a good excuse. This game was played in 1963, and I was born in 1969. And as soon as I was born, I was thinking, b3, that's no good. Okay, so white's exposing his king even more, and white still hasn't developed the king side. And this game really shows how strong Verber was, because what a lot of people do is they have the understanding, well, probably white shouldn't make three queen moves in the opening and then play b3 and then leave all his pieces here, but they don't know how to punish it. So black will make sort of boring, developing, normal moves, and then white will make boring, developing moves, and eventually white's going to be okay. And so when somebody plays badly with white, which is what I feel from the way white's playing, we must punish them. Okay, and Verber man, does he punish them. Verber's not kidding around. And Verber played the move b5. Excellent move, attacking the queen side. I don't know what white's supposed to do. White's king is no good. So he took a pawn. At least white's a pawn up now. Then rook c2. And, man, the truth hurts. So I guess white can sacrifice his queen, but then white's down a queen. So I don't know what the engine says, but I'm sure it says black is winning. Queen b4. Black plays queen c7. And black's going to play rook c8. And he's going to come get the white king. And there's not much white can do about it. Took the knight. Took back. Knight e2. He tripled on the c-file. And I guess if it was black's move here, black could play rook takes knight and queen c2 check, and then d3 check. And then if you're under 18, you're not allowed to look at that position. That's rated, too high for you guys. So black is threatening to win immediately. And if I was a betting man, I would guess d3 also wins immediately. And the reason I say that is because d3 also wins immediately. So black has lots of threats, and all of black's pieces are perfectly placed, and black has a safe king and white doesn't. The game didn't go very long. White played rook d3. That stops black from playing d3, so I'll give him that. Rook c1 check. Obviously, if knight takes rook, queen takes his checkmate. So he played king b2, queen c2 check, king a3 is the only legal move, and then rook to a1 threatens to capture either way on a2 with checkmate. If white could magically defend that, and it would be magic, then I can take this rook for free. But yeah, if you can defend a2, you're a better player than I am. What's funny is, if you play rook d2 to defend a2, that doesn't defend a2. That's still checkmate. So since this is the worst position I've ever seen ever for white, white resigned. Good job. That was white's best move of the game. But white got completely run over that game, so you can actually see how strong Verber was, even though he wasn't famous internationally. You could see that he was a very strong player. And like a lot of people from the Midwest and the US, they don't necessarily get a chance to play abroad or play in lots of big tournaments, which is why a lot of them decide to go to university instead of continue their chess studies. Okay, so next game, that was pretty brutal. And the next game is against Jim Warren, who's also a famous Illinois chess personage. He and his wife, Helen Warren, ran chess tournaments, and they were president and secretary and vice president of the Illinois Chess Association forever. So I don't want to say they ran chess in Illinois, but they were very important, Jim and Helen Warren. And Jim Warren didn't play a lot of chess when I was playing chess. He was directing and organizing with his wife. But this is 1963, so he was playing chess. And this is a game Verber had the white pieces against Jim Warren. And I think in one of the obituaries I read online was actually written by Jim Warren. So, okay. And Verber played e4 and d4 and c4 and knight f3. He didn't care. And they got sort of a normal Sicilian, which is interesting in 1963. And this is the Fischer-Sozin. And Verber played the lines where you castle kingside, which is not as popular today, but in the 60s, that's what Fischer was doing, and Fischer was winning all of his games, so it seemed like a reasonable idea. Okay, and this is still theory today, just the Fischer-Sozin. Probably they play a6 more than bishop d7 now. f4. I mean, this game could be two grandmasters today. Bishop c6, and he played f5, sacrificing a pawn, although this is the point of the way Fischer played the Sozin. when Fischer castled kingside, he had his bishop on this diagonal, and he wanted to play f5 and attack the e6 pawn. So black played e5 to not lose the e6 pawn. And then black was greedy, and he took the pawn on e4. And I don't know if that loses, but boy, did he lose. So if black made a mistake this game, it's probably knight takes e4. Takes, queen g4, threatening the bishop, and also threatening to attack on the king side with moves like f6 and bishop h6. But we have to save our bishop, because can't lose a bishop. Okay, bishop h6, and there's two ways to stop mate. Bishop f6, which was played, and g6. g6 looks incredibly bad because I can take it, and I have pressure here, and I can win the exchange, and I win on f7. So bishop f6 is the only logical move. Unfortunately, the reason black shouldn't take on e4 is because in this position, white has a brilliant winning attack, which is to take on g7. And now black is finished. Played h5. If he takes the bishop, f6, the rook is defending the pawn, the bishop is pinned, I'm threatening queen takes bishop, checkmate. So, I don't know, black resigns. I don't know. Okay, so he played h5, put it in h. Queen g6. It's funny, I was talking to my friend Wes when I visited my family and friends a few days ago, and we were talking about when very strong players that you've heard of play other chess players who aren't as strong, who you haven't heard of. And then when I look at those games, I'm like, this is why you've heard of this guy, and this is why you haven't heard of this guy. So like Morphy versus some doofus, Morphy plays brilliant moves that are attacking, checkmates his opponent in 15 moves, and his opponents defend terribly. And my students are always like, why did the guy defend so badly? And I'm like, that's why you haven't heard of him. If the guy defended great and attacked great and played great openings and calculated great, then you would have heard of him. So you haven't heard of Jim Warren, and we're doing a lecture on Richard Verber, and you can see who the better player is. Okay, it's not black. Okay, so you can't take the queen because the computer won't let me due to this pin here. So maybe next time black will think better about taking the sacrificed pawn. Okay, queen b6 check, spite check. Then queen takes b3. This is a very unusual defense. Black isn't giving his queen away for nothing. Black is removing the pin of the f pawn. So if we take the queen, then black can play pawn takes queen because the bishop on b3 is no longer there. Unfortunately for black, white plays queen takes f6. Now white's threatening the queen, and white is also going to play bishop h6 and queen g7 checkmate. So the truth hurts. So he takes, threatening the rook with check, and rook f1. And now white is just going to play bishop h6, queen g7 mate. I don't see a defense to that. He played queen d4, bishop h6. Black did defend against queen g7 mate, played queen g4. So that's pretty good. He did good. And Verber played h3 and said, would you please move your queen off of g7 so I can checkmate you there? And black played the only move to save his queen and defend g7, queen g3, and Verber, and this was the first time this was ever said, in 1963, he said, I have two rooks, one for each of you. And he played rook f3, sacrificing the exchange. Black has no queen move that would stop queen g7 mate. Black can't allow rook takes queen, so black decided to resign. If black didn't resign, he could take the rook, rook takes, probably queen e1 check, and then I can play rook f1 or king h2. I would play king h2, and then this is unstoppable mate. And if you don't like that mate, rook g3 check is also quite annoying, but queen g7 mate's better. Okay, so that was a pretty crushing victory, and it really shows you how strong Verber was, because when you have players who are club players, like under 2,000, they don't win with white like that. They don't sack on e4, sack on g7, start queen g6. They don't play like that. That's not how they win. But when somebody is much better than their opponent and they're already a strong master, and I mean, a senior master in 1971 was almost unheard of. Okay, let's go to some other great games by Verber. I made a mistake. I kept changing what color Verber was. Okay, now it turns out Verber didn't only play in the United States. He played in the World Student Team Championships for the US team. And this is a game against actually a player I've heard of, George Botterill. And okay, George Botterill's not like the best player in the world, but I've heard of him. That's pretty good. And this was played in 1969. And that was, I mean, pretty close to Verber's peak. Probably between 69 and 74 was when Verber was at his best. Okay, and I was born in 1969, so I approve of this game. Okay, another Sicilian, this time Verber's black. Najdorf Sicilian, 1969 theory. 1969, everybody played bishop g5. Nowadays, they play bishop e3 and f3 and queen d2, but bishop g5 is still played occasionally. And this is one of the main lines. h6 is a little unusual, but nothing wrong with it. And I must admit, I don't normally see white playing such an early f5 move, but it's very aggressive. It attacks the e6 pawn. But I think modern day theory, people would castle queenside here. They wouldn't play f5. And black played e5. Black can also play knight e5 or knight c5. And b5. Bishop e7. And black has a standard Najdorf kind of position. And you're going to see a lot of standard Najdorf ideas. And when black is winning in the Najdorf, a lot of times those lines aren't being played anymore for white. And probably one of the reasons bishop g5 isn't as popular is there were a lot of games that black won and they started looking for other ways to play for white. But okay, this is 1969, so this is a very popular line. Bishop d3, rook c8, and white castled queenside, which white almost always does. And unfortunately, not safe for white's king because black's rook is already on c8. And with the bishop on d3 blocking the queen's defense of the knight, this sort of begs black to sacrifice the exchange, which follows a very important rule: always sacrifice the exchange. So he castles, rook g1, here comes the mating attack, and black sacrifices the exchange. And I think white would like to play queen takes rook, but white played bishop d3 blocking his queen, so he has to take with the pawn, and then d5. And these are standard breaking moves in the Sicilian, sacrificing on c3 and playing d5. This unleashes the bishop to go to a3, and it attacks the pawn on e4 with like all of black's pieces. And black is attacking before white does. White wants to play g4, g5, but white hasn't done that yet. So white has to meet what black is doing. Took on d5, bishop takes a3 check, king b1, bishop takes d5, attacking the queen. Queen moves away, queen c7, threatening queen takes c3, and then queen b2 mate. Very similar to the mate last game, except he has black. Bishop e2, defending the pawn, showing that bishop d3 was a bad move earlier. Rook c8, g4, here comes white. Knight e4, here comes black. Black's threatening knight takes c3 check. Yeah, good luck defending that. Bishop e1, he did defend it. Knight b6, black has another knight coming. And you can see all of black's pieces are have the attack here. Black is attacking with everything. King a1, bishop e7, which stops white from playing g5. And it gets the bishop off of a3, so later my queen can get in there. Queen d6, queen a3 check. g5, he's opening up the g line, sacrificing pawns to get open lines for his rook and queen. Queen e7, as I said, black wants to play queen a3 check. White sacrifices the exchange. Black ignores it. And instead of taking the rook, which would lose your rook on c8, that was the point, black gave his rook on c8 away a better way, played knight a4. And this threatens queen b2 check. So black sacrificed the exchange on c3, black sacrificed a bishop on d5, and now black sacrifices a rook on c8 with check, and his knight's hanging too for good measure. So that's a lot of sacrificing. However, black is threatening queen b2 mate, which is unstoppable. So he took the rook with check, rook takes check, he's trying to get some perpetual check. He takes with the king. If he takes with the bishop, we have queen f5 check, and white is getting a lot of checks. If the king goes back, we have rook d8 check, the bishop has to go to f8, and we could play queen g4 check, or we could take the bishop, and white's getting a lot of checks. So king takes is better, queen g4 check, bishop g5, and now we're threatening queen b2 mate, which we've been threatening for a long time, but unfortunately for white, white's out of checks. So black sacrificed a lot of material, threatened queen b2 check, mate. White gave some spite checks, and then that's it. Now we're going to play queen b2 mate. So white resigned. Brilliant attack from black. Black has other threats too, such as knight takes c3 check, knight takes c3 checkmate. So we're threatening more than one checkmate, but checkmate in one is the best. So another brilliant victory from Richard Verber, and in a very important event. It's a team tournament where they take the top young players in the world and they represent their country, which he played in several times. Okay, and this is in the Chicago Open in 1970, and this is the only player in the lecture today that I've played. He's playing Stephen Tennant, and I've played Stephen Tennant. And I know we have a draw, and I seem to recollect I beat him once, but I could be making that up. But I remember we had a draw in Chicago. Stephen Tennant, also a Chicago player like Richard Verber, so I'm sure they've played many times, and Tennant's been a master for like 40 years. This was played in 1970, probably when they were both at the peak of their strength. Of course, Verber has black, so I have to flip the board again. And Chicago Open 1970, the Chicago Open still happens today. Although it's not in Chicago, but you know, that's the world we live in. Okay, so c4, Verber played g6 again. He played the King's Indian one game, he had black. And this looks like a King's Indian, but it's in English. And he plays h5. And this is a very modern type of way of playing, especially since this is 1970. The computers now, especially Leland Stockfish, they like to push their h-pawn all the way up with white and black. And due to the engines doing that a lot, and AI and such, a lot of the strong grandmasters are doing that too. I've been doing that in 1 minute chess my whole life, but I was kidding. Now it's fashionable. And Verber does get his pawn up there, and he plays h3. So he gets his pawn all the way up. Bishop has to save itself. And I think black already has an excellent position. And yeah, this bishop on e3 is not very good. It's blocked by its pawns. My knight has the f5 square. My bishop's on a nice diagonal. White's bishop was fianchettoed, and this pawn here stops it. So I think the opening has worked out really well in Verber's favor. Sort of blocked in the center. Castles, castles, rook e8. And again, I was complaining earlier, and now I'm going to complain more about this bishop on e3. That's not good. The bishop's completely blockaded. Now black has the two bishops. And white basically has no counterplay here. White's just hoping that they trade all the pieces on the e-file, and maybe he can draw by trading everything. But you can see in the long run, black's king is super safe, white's king is not safe. And when we look at the center, the d pawn is permanently weak because it can't be defended by another pawn. So black can spend the rest of the game trying to attack the d pawn, and white has to defend the d pawn. And if you ask me, okay, what's white's plan? There's nothing in black's position that white can attack. So white has no plan, and white has to defend his d pawn and make sure black never plays queen g2 mate, which seems like a favorite of Verber's. In the games we're looking at, Verber always gets his queen in there and checkmates his opponent, which looks like it might happen later in this game.
Yeah, I have a question here.
Yes.
Just right in this position. So when I look at this, I ask myself, you say right away, well, it's clearly about the d pawn that is backwards, right? That's what you call it, the backward pawn, or like the attack.
I wouldn't say it's not technically backward, but it's very weak.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so...
And the reason it's weak is it can't be defended by another pawn, and it has a permanent attacker. Mm-hmm. If white could play pawn to c3, that would be fine, but can't do that.
Okay. So how do you, like, when you look at a position like this, another idea I would have had in my mind looking at the board is making like doubling these rooks on like the e file.
Oh yeah, that's
behind them.
That's exactly the right plan. Right, doubling rooks on the e file. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's very hard for white to do that because white doesn't have any squares to put his rooks.
Okay.
You can see the rook can't go here, can't go here.
So you kind of combine those ideas of attacking the d pawn and doubling the rooks and like
exactly. Yeah.
And white would be overloaded. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, got it.
So white played knight d1. Perhaps white wants to play knight f2. I don't know. And black just takes the knight because the bishop on e3 is so terrible. And then queen e4, threatening checkmate. And in this position, white made a tactical mistake, although I'm not envious of his position. He played rook f3. And I'm guessing, unless there's something I'm missing, which is 50-50, that white should play queen d2 here. The problem is, if I play queen d2, which seems to defend everything, I can't play bishop f2 later because of checkmate. So now black can just double rooks here, and I think black's just going to crash through. So he played rook f3, which stops black from playing queen g2 mate later, so that if it was white's move, white could play bishop f2. And unfortunately for white, for tactical reasons, rook f3 doesn't work. And we're going to crash through now by playing bishop takes d4. And there's a pin on the bishop. So if you take the bishop this way, you're going to lose your rook on e1. And if you take with the queen, I trade queens and then take your rook on e1. So rook f3 is either a bad tactical mistake or white decided there's no play if you play queen d2. Black just going to double rooks on the e-file and play bishop takes d4 at his leisure. Also, I guess queen g2 check wins. Like if I double rooks on the e-file, then queen g2 check should win also. So, okay, so he didn't do that. He played rook f3, takes, king f2, and black's just up a pawn. Black can't take with this rook because checkmate gives black the advantage. So he took with the correct rook. Now, white's down a pawn, and white has 2 pawns under attack, and white's king is no good. Otherwise, white's doing great. Rook c3. Now black's 2 pawns up and threatening the b2 pawn. And this is just white not resigning. Black's having all the fun. And in this position, if you take on h3, I can play rook c2, b4, rook here, and you can't defend all your pawns. You're going to lose a lot of pawns. Although I still would have done that, but he played rook c3 because the h-pawn's not running away. And black is just up a past d-pawn, so pretty easy win for black. White tried to get counterplay, but trying is the first step to failure. And now white played a move I would never consider, but I understand why he played it. If you play the obvious move, rook d1, I play rook g7 check, your king has to go to the h-file, then I play d3, and I'm just going to win. But that's what he should have done. He played rook takes d4 check. Very suspicious. And king f5, but the counterplay was insufficient. I like the move f5 a lot, because white has to decide whether he's going to let black do this, or whether he's going to take and lose his h-pawn, and both ways lose. So he chose this way. And in this position, white resigned, because if white queens, we take on f4, and like if I was black, I would make a bishop and a knight. Maybe a bishop and knight is a joke, but not in a tournament game. I would make several queens. So instead of being down 2 or 3 queens in this position, after king e4, white resigned. So those were crushing games against players that were probably somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 US chess rating. And he basically crushed everybody. And in game 3, that was in the World Student Team Championship against a guy who was an IM, and he crushed that guy too. So Verber was quite a strong player. I was told, but I can't prove it, that he was a very good blitz player also. I actually saw him play blitz chess when I was 9 years old, but I couldn't really judge the level of his play because I was 9 years old. So and he played better than me, that's for sure. But I wasn't any good when I was 9. So it happens a lot that in various countries there are people who are famous, especially in Europe, in their country, but they're not famous outside of their country. And the US is such a big country land-wise and people-wise. There's people who are famous in their regions where they live, but they're not famous throughout the country or throughout the world. And Richard Verber in the 60s and 70s was a good example of this. Somebody who in the Midwest, and especially in Chicago, was a very well-known figure and a very strong player. But if you talk to the strong European grandmasters, they're probably like, who's Richard Verber? So the truth hurts. But there's millions of people who play chess, and that's why we have these lectures, because some of the ones that aren't as famous as other people, we can bring them fame through their great chess games and through information on the internet. I want to thank our sponsor again, David Buck and the 1995 Illinois Math and Science Academy chess team. Thanks for sponsoring the lecture. We have lectures every Monday. I'm Grandmaster Ben Feingold. I hope you enjoyed that lecture, and I'll see you guys next time here on YouTube. Bye, everybody.